Many of you may already be familiar with the philosophy of Confucianism and how it shaped the development of Chinese culture and history for over more than 2,000 years. But did you know that ancient Chinese history actually had 9 major schools of thought? Hey everyone, I'm Amy. Today I'm going to talk about one of those 9 schools, Mo or Moism. Today, Moism is often considered to be ancient China's school of engineering. Its followers became famous for their knowledge of mechanics and military technology, and were responsible for many inventions of ancient China. But what was most interesting about this school of thought was that it was actually not about engineering or invention at all. Moism was a philosophy built by craftsmen and commoners instead of the wealthy and nobility, and it was a philosophy about love and peace. It argued that you should care for another person's family as you would your own, and strongly opposed aggressive warfare. But unfortunately, when someone has the ability to build great machines of destruction, they're often forced to become a part of war. And that is exactly what happened with the ancient followers of Moism. They were engineers who genuinely wanted peace, but became some of ancient China's greatest military engineers. By the end of the Warring States period, Confucianism and Moism were the 2 dominant schools of that time. And then, after becoming one of the most recognized school of thought in ancient China, it completely disappeared. Before we get started, let's take a moment to talk about the sponsor of today's video, Where Winds Meet. Where Winds Meet is a free-to-play open-world action RPG set in the early years of the Northern Song dynasty. You play as a wanderer navigating a world of political intrigue and martial arts. The game just launched its 2.0 update, Hidden Mountain, which introduces a brand new vertical mountain region built around a 1,000-year-old hidden city, and a brand new sect called Moist Hill. The entire region is essentially a giant mechanism city built by that same in-game sect. Instead of joining a sect built purely around combat, players who join Moist Hill research mechanisms, submit engineering papers, and build their own inventions in a system called Divine Craft. And there is even more coming on August 20th, when the 2.1 update introduces a new boss, a new casual game mode, and a new martial art. If you're interested in the history of Moism, Where Winds Meet's new patch is a great way to experience it for yourself. I'll leave a link in the description below. Moism gets its name from its founder, Mo Zi, whose personal name was Mo Di. We don't know his exact birth or death year, but many historians place his life somewhere between roughly 470 and 391 BCE, right around the start of the Warring States period. This would have been about a generation or 2 after Confucius. We're also not sure which state he belonged to, but some traditions point to Song and others to Lu. What we do know is that he likely came from a lower social background, possibly a craftsman himself. Mo Zi wasn't a noble who philosophized about the lives of commoners from a distance. According to later accounts, Mo Zi actually started out studying under Confucian teachers, but he grew frustrated with what he saw as their obsession with elaborate rituals, expensive funerals, and rigid hierarchy, all of which he believed drained resources away from ordinary people without actually solving their problems. So he decided to break away and build something new, something that he felt better served the common people. The philosophy itself is built on 10 core ideas. At the center of Moism is Jian'ai, which means impartial love. Confucianism taught that love should be graded. You love your parents more than your neighbors, and your neighbors more than a stranger. Mo Zi rejected this and argued that you should care about another person's parents, another person's country, and another person's family exactly as much as your own. He understood that equal care did not always mean equal treatment. But his point was that if everyone looked out for their own family or their own state, everyone eventually ends up at war with everyone else. If everyone cares equally about everyone, then that motive for conflict disappears. The Confucian philosopher Meng Zi criticized Mo Zi's idea of love, saying that it would destroy all structures of society. Another core idea of Moism is Fei Gong, the opposition to aggression. He argued that if killing one person is murder, then why was killing multitudes of people praised in war? But this wasn't total pacifism. He accepted that sometimes war could be just or even needed, such as to remove a tyrant. What Mozi opposed was wars of pure conquest, where a stronger state invaded a weaker one just to seize land or loot its wealth. This was no different than theft, just carried out with soldiers instead of thieves. The rest of the 10 core ideas are really just the same logic applied to different problems. Shang Xian argued that positions of power should go to the genuinely talented, regardless of birth, a radical idea in a world run almost entirely by hereditary nobility and nepotism. Shang Tong called for society to follow a single, shared standard of right and wrong, because Mozi believed that when everyone followed their own idea of what was right and wrong, society would fall into chaos. Jie Yong and Jie Zang rejected extravagant spending and elaborate funerals, arguing that burying the dead with riches and holding lengthy periods of mourning drained resources the living desperately needed. Tianzhi and Ming Gui argued that heaven itself had a will, and that spirits actively rewarded good behaviors and punished cruelty, holding even rulers accountable to a moral standard above their own authority. Fei Yue opposed lavish court music and ceremony, on the grounds that it consumed enormous resources and produced nothing anyone could eat, wear, or build with. Fei Mi rejected the idea of a fixed, unchangeable fate. The argument was that people could change their circumstances through their own actions, rather than simply accepting that everything had already been decided for them. 10 ideas that all point to one underlying ideal. Cut the waste, share the burden, and don't act like some lives matter more than others. Mozi didn't just teach a philosophy, he built an organization around it. And it wasn't really like a school at all. Some describe it as a disciplined order. Others call it something closer to a cult. This order of Moism was a highly organized community that was part philosophical school, part religious order, and part military organization, with followers spread across multiple states. Mozi traveled with his disciples, intervened directly in the politics of other states, personally taught defensive military techniques, and acted less like a lecturer and more like the head of an actual organization. The leader of the group was known as Juzi, kind of like a grand master, and members were called Mozhe, or Moists. And the Juzi wasn't just a teacher, he was the actual head of the organization, with authority over the Moists under him. Members were expected to follow his leadership and obey the rules of the order. After Mozi's death, however, the order would eventually fragment into different groups spread across China. Instead of all of them answering to a single leader, these different Moist groups would each have their own Juzi. Being a Moist wasn't simply a matter of agreeing with Mozi's ideas. Members were expected to live according to them. They followed the organization's rules, learned practical skills, traveled where they were needed, and supported the movement with their own labor and money. They lived by a code of austerity, wearing rough clothes, eating plain food, and working constantly. The order also trained specialists in defensive warfare. When a weaker state was threatened with invasion, Moists could travel there and help organize its defense, bringing knowledge of fortifications, siege weapons, and counter-siege techniques with them. The entire order was designed to actively put the ideal of opposition to aggression into practice. Members who took government positions were expected to actually implement Moist policies once in office, not just to advance their own careers. And if they couldn't, they were expected to resign rather than compromise. They were even required to donate part of their salary back to the organization. A member's loyalty was to Moism first. Sometime around the late 4th century, the leader of one Moist group was a man named Fu Tun, and while living in the state of Qing, his own son committed murder. Normally, the penalty for murder was death, but King Hui of Qing personally intervened. The king respected the Moists, so he offered to spare the young man's life. But Fu Tun refused the pardon, explaining that the Moist rules must be followed, and said, "He who kills shall be put to death, and he who injures shall be punished. This is how we prevent people from killing and harming one another." and his son was executed. But that was what it meant to belong to the Maoist order. Its rules governed how you worked and how you lived. Where Winds Meet actually recreates this idea through the new Maoist Hill sect. It isn't just a place where you learn about Maoism. Players can actually join the Maoist order, become one of its disciples, and work their way up through its ranks. So how did a school of thought built around love and peace become famous for engineering and invention? Part of the answer is that Maoism had a very different attitude toward practical work than many of its philosophical rivals. Confucianism generally supported an ordered society that valued moral cultivation over physical labor. The Confucian philosopher Mengzi said that some labor with their minds and some labor with their strength. Those who labor with their minds govern others. Those who labor with their strength are governed by others. Other philosophers were even suspicious of technology itself. One passage from the philosophical text, Zhuangzi, says that wherever there are machines, there is bound to be mechanical work. And wherever there is mechanical work, there is bound to be a scheming mind. Once a scheming mind is formed, there are ulterior motives, and purity is lost. But Maoism took almost the opposite approach. Mozi himself likely came from a lower social background, and many of his followers appear to have been craftsmen and other working people. Their philosophy judged ideas largely by whether they produced real benefits for ordinary people. They cared about whether a machine actually worked and whether an idea actually improved people's lives. Complex rituals and traditions had nothing to do with it. The only thing that mattered was if it helped people. And over time, Maoist thinkers began applying that same way of thinking to problems far beyond ethics and politics. The later Maoist writings explore logic and language, mathematics and geometry, mechanics, optics, economics, and even the theory of knowledge itself. They defined concepts, classified different kinds of objects and relationships, studied cause and effect, and tested how things behaved in the physical world. So even though the core philosophies of Maoism really had nothing to do with engineering at all, it became the perfect school for rewarding experimentation and practical problem solving. So how did a philosophy built around opposing aggression end up producing some of the deadliest engineerings of its time? Well, while rulers and kings had no interest in the concept of impartial love, they were very much interested in engineers who were capable of building machines of war in a period when every state was constantly at war. Being useful mattered more than being right. And the Maoists were, regardless of their philosophy, extremely useful. But the Maoists drew a clear line between aggression and defense. They were willing to help states defend their cities and often found themselves helping smaller and weaker states against the more powerful ones. Maoists understood that moral argument alone couldn't stop an invading army. But a fortified wall, a better machine, or an engineer who knew how to defend an enemy siege weapon could. Engineering allowed the Maoists to make their ideals of non-aggression enforceable rather than just aspirational. So Maoist engineers willingly traveled to states threatened by invasion. They helped strengthen fortifications and designed defensive machines against attacking armies. They hoped that through their technology, they could deter the strong from preying on the weak. It kind of reminds me of Tony Stark a little bit, building weapons in the name of peace. Today, all of the surviving Maoist texts are compiled together into a book called Mozi, in honor of the founder of Maoism. The Mozi book contains the teachings and philosophy of Maoism, but it also contains a lot of information about Maoist scientific findings, including logic, geometry, mechanics, and optics. 6 chapters of the Mozi book are known today as the Mojing, the Maoist canon. These chapters read almost like scientific notes and shows a systematic way of understanding and testing how the world worked. The Maoist canon contains the world's earliest written description of the pinhole camera effect. It explains that light travels in straight lines, so when light passes through a tiny opening, the rays cross and produce an upside-down image on the other side. It also documents experimentation regarding the principle of reflection using different types of mirrors. The Mohist canon also talks about mechanics, with an early explanation of force in relation to motion, along with an analysis of balance and leverage. It describes the use of leverage to draw water for agriculture irrigation, greatly reducing the required labor. It also contains detailed information regarding ropes, wheels, weights, and lifting, with real-world applications in construction and transport. There is also an interesting passage about structural engineering that examines how much weight a wooden beam can support before it bends. It even contains thoughts related to geometry, with early explanation of the concept of lines, space, and geometric points. And beyond physical science, the Mohist canon also explores the theory of knowledge. It distinguishes between different ways of knowing: things you know through direct experience, things you learn from others, and things you could work out through reasoning. It also documents ideas around the structure of thought and language, with theories about how words correspond to things in the real world. One ancient story said that Mozi once built a wooden bird, a muyuan, that could actually fly in the air for an entire day, which amazed everyone who saw it. Now, we don't know for sure if he actually built a machine that could fly, and many historians treat the story more like a parable. But Mozi was not proud of this invention. He said that a wooden bird that could fly for just a single day was not as useful as a wooden linchpin, which was much easier to make and would remain useful for much longer. To Mozi, an invention wasn't impressive simply because it was clever. What mattered was whether it was actually able to help people. But the Mozi isn't just a book of philosophy and science. An entire section of it actually seems more like a military engineering manual. Several chapters are focused entirely on how to defend a city, how to prepare the gates and walls, position defenders, communicate between different parts of the city, and counter the machines of an attacking army. And within these instructions were descriptions of remarkable inventions. Machines of war. The 转射机 was a rotating shooting mechanism installed along the city wall and operated by defenders, allowing the weapon itself to be redirected without moving the entire machine. The 连弩车 was a mounted, mechanically wound crossbow cart capable of unleashing dozens of bolts at concentrated groups of attackers before needing to be reloaded. The 集车 was a heavy iron machine operated by multiple men that could hurl stones and burning coals at attacking forces, functioning something like an ancient piece of artillery. And then there was the 行城, a defensive structure that could be rapidly constructed during battles in order to reinforce the city wall against enemy siege machines. This tradition of Mohist engineering eventually led to the modern pop culture idea of 墨家机关术, or Mohist mechanical arts, which is an exaggeration of ancient Mohist engineering into a skill for building fantastical machines. And according to modern Chinese pop culture, Mohism was also famous for creating puppets. And I don't mean puppets like Sesame Street or the Muppets. I mean large, human-sized mechanical puppets. Something closer to androids. These human-sized mechanical puppets appear in ancient Chinese legends as machines that could seemingly move like living people. But there is no evidence that anything like them actually existed. And in the Where Winds Meet 2.0 update, you can experience a reimagination of these Mohist puppets through the new bosses, the Puppet Sword Maiden and Ci and Tuo, the twin puppets. Where Winds Meet takes this fantasy version of Mohist mechanism arts even further, with enormous mechanical creatures and bosses that you can actually fight yourself. And you can even create Mohist inventions yourself through the new Divine Craft system. But for all of their inventions and all of their legends, the school of Mohism completely disappeared from Chinese history during the Han Dynasty. So how did such a prominent and useful school of thought completely disappear? The truth is, we don't really know. But historians and later folklore gives us several theories. The first is political. Moism wasn't just a philosophy, and the Moists weren't just harmless scholars. It was an independent and disciplined organization with military expertise, its own rules, and its own leaders. That worked in the divided world of the Warring States period. But once China was unified under a centralized imperial government, the order of Moism very likely became more of a threat than a useful school of philosophy. A second explanation suggests that the Moists destroyed themselves by doing exactly what they believed in. As the kingdom of Qin conquered state after state during its unification of China, the Moists repeatedly had to take the side of the losing kingdoms, and it was possible that many of them died while defending against Qin armies. City by city, the Moists would have lost their members until there was almost nobody left. Another theory is related to Moism itself. After Mozi's death, the Moist order gradually split into distinct branches, each with its own leader and interpretation. It is said that these different factions developed contradictory teachings, eventually fragmenting and competing with each other. And Moism never produced another prominent leader who was influential enough to carry the philosophy forward after the death of its founder, Mozi. And then there's a theory related to Qin Shi Huang's famous burning of books. While a lot of knowledge was undeniably lost during this time, and many schools of thought were harmed, the damage was much more difficult for a tradition like Moism to recover from. Moism wasn't only a philosophy, it was also generations of knowledge about science, engineering, and military technology. And once that knowledge was destroyed, some of it could simply be lost forever. And finally, during the Han Dynasty, Confucianism became the primary school of thought in imperial education and government. As generations of scholars increasingly studied the Confucian classics in pursuit of official careers, the other schools gradually lost influence and followers. And Moism was never an easy philosophy to follow. It required a strict lifestyle of austerity and discipline. And as Moism lost its influence and political importance, there were fewer and fewer reasons for new generations to accept those sacrifices. By the time the Grand Historian Sima Qian was writing the records of the Grand Historian, he didn't even include that much information about Moism, instead recording just a few lines about the founder of Moism, Mozi. Many historians took this as a sign of just how much Moism had already declined by this time. And very soon after, Moism disappeared from Chinese history entirely. It wouldn't be until the Ming Dynasty, over 1,000 years later, that surviving Moist texts would be discovered within a copy of the Dao Zang. It appears to have been miscategorized as a part of the Taoist collection. Ming Dynasty scholars then produced new printed editions of the discovered Moist texts, but it was filled with many ancient copying errors and remained extremely difficult to understand. And then in the late Qing Dynasty, the scholar Sun Yirang spent decades restoring and correcting the Moist texts that he could find, eventually publishing his work as the Mozi Jiangu, which would become the basis of everything that we know about Moism today. But what if the followers of Moism hadn't fully disappeared? What if they went into hiding instead as a secret sect? The 2.0 update of Where Winds Meet imagines that exact scenario. A secretive Moist sect that has survived in isolation for 1,000 years, only now stepping back out into the world of the Song Dynasty. And even when the disciples of Moist Hill finally leave their mountain, they have to hide who they are. They disguise themselves as members of other sects to protect their secret techniques. And if another player discovers their true identity, they can even be knocked out and kidnapped. And the game doesn't just borrow the Moist machines. Where Winds Meet takes the Moist philosophy, engineering, and the way of life and turns it into an entire Jianghu world that you can actually experience for yourself. And it brings back the same question that defined Moism itself. What responsibility do people with knowledge and power have to everyone else? Unfortunately, the real Moists of history probably weren't hiding somewhere in the mountains, and historical evidence indicates that the order of Moism completely died out during the Han Dynasty. But thanks to the writings that survived, the Moists weren't entirely forgotten. It was a fascinating school of thought that was quite different from the other philosophies of ancient China. It was a school founded by commoners and craftsmen, a philosophy about love and peace, practiced by people who built machines of war. And contrary to the very foundations of imperial China, they believed that ability should matter more than birth, and that everything should be judged by whether or not it actually improved people's lives. What do you think about Moism? Let me know in the comments. That's it for today's video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.
Stay curious, stay magical.